Good afternoon. Good afternoon, friends. Thank you for being here this afternoon. We know that Thaipusam procession is going on outside, and there's some delay. Even that is, as we know, part of India, and what we are discussing today will be some other parts of India. And India, of course, is culturally very complex. It is not easy for anyone outside of India, or sometimes very often even within India, to navigate. And we are very, very fortunate here today to have 4 very distinguished speakers who will be sharing with us their understandings, their research on different aspects of modern Indian art. And what I'll do is I'll first introduce the 4 panelists in the order of their presentation. And if you follow the presentation, you will see why we are doing it this way, because it will begin with a broad overview, and then we will look at the questions of nationalism, post-colonial realities, and so on. Like most other places in the world, we are struggling with a lot of such issues here in Singapore, of course. And this will be followed by a presentation focusing on Calcutta, talking about the Bengal school, and yet, it is not easy to give it a simple definition. Again, like any other schools in art history, the actual story is actually always a lot more complex than how a definition would try to delineate that. And finally, we're going to look at the Baroda school, and to look at very specifically art historical approach to see how we can sometimes go in and out of such schools in order to help us understand much better the concrete works of individual artists in this different historical contexts and circumstances. Now, I'm reminded, when we were planning this, I'm reminded of the exhibition over at the National Gallery here in Singapore, which is entitled, what was it? Decorations and Dreams, right? And the idea of decorations and dreams is if you try to present a show on Southeast Asian art, we probably have a similar situation here with Indian art. That is, on the one hand, you have a lot of materials that are being verbalized. So you have the ISMs, the schools, the movements, and the cities, right? I mean, to make things a lot more complicated, the geopolitics of different regions and cities in India. We're looking at Calcutta, of course, Bombay, and Baroda, and with Thaipusam going out, not forgetting the south. So this is what we are looking at, and the National Gallery is telling the viewers that look, we try to present this in terms of art history, as in different movements in Indonesian art, in Singapore art, and so on. However, it is equally important, even for the artists themselves, as they created the words, is to be thinking about dreams. In other words, there is on the one hand the verbalization of the decorations, and there is on the other hand the dreams that may be expressed in the individual words. Let's see, if we could try to explore the kind of parameters as we go into the subtleties of Indian modern art today. So I said I was going to introduce the speakers in the order of the content, the topic of the presentation. So first we have Dr. Zara Jumaboy, who is a UK-based writer, a speaker, and art historian. And she was the Stephen and Eleanor Hines Scholar at the Courtauld Institute of Art, London, where she completed her PhD, and is an associate lecturer specializing in modern and contemporary South Asian art. She co-organizes Contemporaneity in South Asian Art, a public seminar series at the Courtauld, and she has been editor of the visual arts section of Time Out Mumbai, Bombay, and an editor at the journal Art India. Her book, The Empire Strikes Back, Indian Art Today, was published by Random House, London. She is also the guest curator of the Progressive Revolution, Modern Art for a New India, currently going on at the Asia Society in New York. That show closes on January the 20th, so tell your friends in New York to go catch the show. It's still early in the morning in New York at this point, so they still have one day to do that, and don't miss that. So that show is also very much inspired by her doctorate research at Koto. So we are pleased to have Zara here today. Now the next speaker is Dr. Tony C., who is currently Associate Lecturer in Political Science and International Relations at the University of London program offered in SIMGE. He has taught international studies in Monash University and media studies in the National University of Singapore. He has research interests in political philosophy and has studied with luminaries like Nancy Hart, Agamben, Zizek, and Badiou. He is also the author of Community Without Identity, the Ontology and Politics of Heidegger, published in 2009. He's also has research interests in Eastern philosophies and intercultural studies, and editor of The Lurch and Buddhism. And here we're back to India again, Buddhism, published in London 2017. Now, the third speaker today, we have none other than Professor Kumar, our own SMU professor, who is the Lee Kong Chian Professor of Marketing at the Singapore Management University and Distinguished Fellow at INSEAD, Emerging Markets Institute. He has previously taught at Harvard Business School, IMD Switzerland, London Business School, and Northwestern University. Meyer's art collection, is focused on the Bengal school from the first half of the 20th century. So here we have a business school professor as well as an art collector. He actively supports museum exhibitions and publications through his art collection, and serve on the South Asia Acquisition Committee of Take Modern. In recognition of his patronage of South Asian art, he was awarded an honorary fellowship by the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, University of London, 2012. Now, last but not least, we have Dr. Priya Jaradi, who is currently the convener of Art History, a collaboration between Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences in US and the National Gallery, Singapore. She earned an MA in Art History from SOAS again in 2001, a PhD from NUS 2012, and a postdoctoral fellowship at the International Institute for Asian Studies, Leiden, Netherlands. Former curator at the Asian Civilizations Museum, ACM Singapore, she also co-curated the Portrait of a Community, National Gallery of Modern Art, Mumbai, and Beauty in Asia, ACM, Tautology of Memory, NUS Museum, as well as having authored two important titles, Baroda, a Cosmopolitan Provenance in Transition, as well as Fashioning a National Art, published by University of Oxford. Now, without further ado, I shall invite the first speaker, who will also give us an overview of the subject that we are getting into today, right? Thank you. Zara?
Hello. Sorry, I'm so used to being the last speaker that I usually have a little doze. And yeah, yes. So I won't go over the limit, 15 minutes exactly, right? We are allowed. And sort of any questions and things, if they can be afterwards, but do sort of feel free to ask lots of them, and also to argue stuff out, because it's going to be an overview, but as is usual, the overview that I will present will be a slightly contentious one, and I'm expecting that each other speaker will pick up on their phase of the modern period that they're looking at, and perhaps it will generate a sort of a sudden richness of debate, both with the Bengal school and then with the progressives, and finally with Baroda, and how these three actually relate to each other, but even to the cities or places that give them their name, because as we know with art historical movements, they often get labeled something, and that label is in itself slightly contentious. And given that we're dealing with Indian art, and all things Indian tend to be contentious from the start anyway, like just in terms of definition, even internally nobody can agree. So, which makes it quite fun for us. So this is called Splitting the Difference, 3 Tales of Modern Indian Art. And the first image that I've started with is actually the first major difference that we'll be looking at today, caused by, everybody loves to blame the British, and so I'll start off by doing that, caused by, of course, the British. So we start with British India at some level, and we start with the partition of the subcontinent, and that happens in 1947. And this is what we're looking at with this opening image. It's actually an artwork made by Nalini Malani and Iftikhar Dadi. So Nalini is an Indian artist, for lack of a better definition. Iftikhar is a scholar, but he is also a Pakistani artist. And so it was a collaborative work made out of sequins that they commissioned. And so this is a work that was made in 1997. But the image that we've got on the screen now was a reconstituted image of that work, and it was reconstituted in 2007. And this is because the original was lost, and it was done by sending these little pieces of cloth that have got sequins on them across the border. And it was a particular group of craftspeople who specialize in this kind of work, and it's called Zardozi work. And this kind of zari sequin work is usually made by craftspeople, karigars, who tend to be Muslim. So on both sides of the border, these are Muslim craftspeople, a very intricate craft that was probably reached its high point during the Mughals. So it's a dying industry. And this is why when they were recreating the work in 2007, when this one had been lost, it didn't really look as great. And so that also became part of the work. But anyway, the reason that I'm starting here is that what it's depicting is, on one side you have a border in the north that is creating Pakistan, so that's the left. And then on the right you have the border that makes Bangladesh. So the line that I'm actually talking about in 1947 is called the Radcliffe Line. So this is a 1947 map of India and Cyril Radcliffe's line. So I don't know how much people know about the history of this period, but Cyril Radcliffe was called in by the Viceroy of India at the time, who was Mountbatten. And Cyril Radcliffe was a British judge and a cartographer. He'd never been to the subcontinent before, right? Had no knowledge. I mean, forget about the culture or language or anything else. And he was basically just made to draw on the map where these lines would fall. So quite hilariously, he's become very much the villain of the piece. Like W.H. Auden has written a poem about partition, criticizing him. And also, after he finished drawing the line, he immediately left because he said, there will be millions of people baying for my blood, and I'm anxious that they don't find me. So this is the Radcliffe line. And the other reason that the sequence is done in read is that the work was called Bloodlines, and of course what it represents is the sort of the splitting of the subcontinent and the formation just at the sort of at the time that these two nations are born, India and Pakistan. It's a really bloody birth, right? Because you have, with partition, a mass movement of people going across the border and no image at all. So it died on this. So there's Nehru releasing the dove of peace. And this is just after Indian independence. That's 1947. But as we've said, this is an independence that comes with a huge cost and a lot of loss of life. And in a way, the legacy of this kind of partition, where you have migrants from across the border moving across what is now then being called a Muslim Pakistan and a secular India. So this is quite an important dialogue for us today, because I'm not picking up on the Muslim Pakistan, I'm picking up on the secular India. And so part of what we're talking about when I give you this overview is two words. One is India, and the idea of the nation embodied in that, and how the three movements look at it very quickly. And the second word is, of course, secular. And so if you have a country across the border whose entire definition of their right to exist is religion, right, is being Muslim, and you have migrants who go across because they're Muslim, you also have Hindus and Christians who come across to India, but they come as, and you also have Muslims who stay behind. And the thing that brings the sort of Indian narrative together is this idea of the secular. And the secular here is not non-religious, so it is not, in a Western context, when you say secular, very often you mean a separation of state and church. That's not what we mean within this context, and it's certainly not what I mean. And what the way I'm using it here is a multi-religious context. And as you'll see from the movement of each art form, it very much plays with this idea of multi-religious in that sense, right? So dawn of Indian independence, Nehru believing very much in unity in diversity, so the diverse religions, the diverse castes, all of this, and he's releasing the dove of peace, which takes a while to become a reality, but it's a hope at this point when he's releasing it. And now we're moving on to the three separate movements that I'm going to be talking about very quickly. And here's some of the questions that we're dealing with. So what part did art play in the British demise, i.e. in them having to leave South Asia? What role did it serve in the construction of Indianness post-British imperialism and post-partition? And this paper will briefly examine three pivotal moments in modern Indian art, and they are the Bengal School of Art, and this is pre-independence, Bombay, and then Bombay's Progressive Artist Group, and in Baroda, respectively. And our answers will come from here. And as I've said, like all things to do with India, as you will no doubt witness today, art historians are much like politicians, and they never agree on the answers. But that just makes our life more exciting. So the early 20th century saw the rise of what has come to be lauded, and in many cases, as we will see with the progressives, also lampooned, as the Bengal School of Art. So post-independence, the Progressive Artist Group come into being, and they're highly critical of the Bengal School. And they take on the mantle of fashioning a new art for what they call a new India. And then, of course, in the 1980s, late 70s and the 80s, you have the Delhi-based art historian Geeta Kapoor championing narrative figuration. And what she really champions at that point is the Baroda School of Art, And of course, there's an increasing amount of debate as to whether it should even be called the Baroda School, because so many of its members actually were quite influential in Bombay. But for what it's worth, like what we call the Baroda School of Art has a particular politics. And just as the progressives were very keen to knock the Bengal school, you have the Baroda School very keen to knock the progressives. So each school comes into being taking a fight with the school that goes on before it. And of course, each one of them, and this is kind of important to us today when we're looking at the question of the modern, each one of them, as they pick their fight, they're actually drawing on tradition. And this is quite, I wouldn't say unusual, actually, for the history of modern art, whether it's Western modernism or whether it's Asia. But in an Asian context, we're much more honest about the way tradition is used. And our modernism always includes that reference to tradition in its ambit. But of course, what is really interesting here is that each time a new school comes into being, it picks a different bit of the tradition, or at least it says it picks a different bit of the tradition. And this is where, by the time we come to the end of my presentation, which will be very soon, I promised you, we can actually trace a single thread in this, in the tradition that is being picked each time, and say, actually, they're not so different as the artists involved would have us believe. But, that's something we can also debate. So I'm starting with the progressive problem of being modern. So what is the problem with being modern, right? So if we're here today to discuss modern Indian art, what is this modern business? So the modern business has two major issues. And first is, here we have state modern. It's no reference to any museum anywhere in the world, whatever people might or might not think. And this was on a very famous museum's website. I first gave this talk in London, not this talk specifically, but showed this image in London about 1.5 years ago. And there were people scribbling furiously, and I got a few hate mail after that. And I've never been able to find this quote again. So whichever museum, not naming anybody, has taken it down. But why is it important to us today? It's important because, look, modernism is a movement in Western arts and literature. Oh, because it doesn't exist anywhere else. Okay, but it's not there anymore. So, but this kind of attitude towards the modern is why an Indian artist like Giv Patel, and quite recently, would make a statement like this. The modern Indian artist was the favorite whipping boy for art professors, newspaper reviewers, columnists, and he was because he was pronounced Western, rootless, imitative, and sterile. So it's like a no-win situation, right? If you look too Western, then you're westernized and derivative, and then you get criticized. If you look too Indian, then, you can't be modern because everybody knows modernism is a Western movement. So you're kind of jammed in the middle of that. So this is the kind of dialogue that, traditionally a modern Indian artist would try to unpick. Of course, over here today, if the modern Indian artist is a whipping boy, we're less interested in what the West thinks because, well, we're in Singapore, and so I think we don't really need to go into too much about, defending Asian modernism to an Asian audience. So the whippings, as it were, that we will witness are more Indians to fellow Indians, right? So they're kind of within the schools. And a very, very sort of quick look at each movement and what they're criticizing. So we're starting here with before independence, so the 19th century, and with academic realism. And so the Brits, particularly with the British Raj, when it institutes itself formally in 1857, you have the Minutes of Education by Macaulay, and one of the things he says is we're creating a race that might be Indian in blood and color, but in every other way they're going to be British, right? And one of the things that they do is denigrate Indian painting. So miniatures are all called old-fashioned. You only paint like that because you can't draw and you don't have scientific perspective, so we must teach you. So within the academies, and among them is Bombay, the trading centers, Calcutta, you have the British academies that train people to be artists. I mean, quite ironically, in Bombay, for instance, you have the JJ School of Art, which still never really talked about the artists that were coming out of there as artists, because everybody knows Indians can't make art, right? It must be craft. So, I mean, and that was very much a thing, right? So, but in spite of that, the whole idea was academic realism, scientific perspective, and this kind of work. So that's Zoffany. And out of that comes a really famous, perhaps the first modern Indian artist, and that's Raja Ravi Verma. Women kind of much more kind of fulsomely delineated, and then somebody who Nirmalya, so Heyman Mazumdar. So this is the kind of tradition, right? So Heyman is actually much later on, but follows that academic realist tradition. Now, the first fight begins. Still before independence, but you have the drive to independence, and you have the drive towards a nationalist Swaraj, self-rule at least. First it starts as Swaraj and self-rule, and then it becomes a full-fledged nationalism. So this is the Bengal School of Art, and what do they do? Immediately, the Bengal School of Art in Bengal, so this is the area that you're looking at. And you have West Bengal and East Bengal, quite interesting. If you remember the map of partition, 1947, East Bengal goes happily, inverted commas, to Pakistan when it forms in 1947, and then in 1971 decides it's unhappy, speaks a different language, and forms Bangladesh, right? But at this point, you have a Bengal, and you have the formation of a Bengal school within this period in the drive towards Swaraj, self-rule. And one of the ways in which the Bengal school comes together, and a founder member of that would be Abindranath Tagore, whose work we will see. And Abindranath Tagore and an English educator called E.B. Havel generate a movement that is highly critical of academic realism, because they see it as a British import, but also as a rationalist import that takes away from India's spiritualism, right? And they want to reconnect with a kind of pan-Asian spiritualism. And that's where it's getting its heritage from. So the kind of work that they're looking at is pre-modern. And they're looking at Mughal painting. That's one reference point. And another reference point is actually ancient Japanese and Chinese ink washes and Rohingya painting. And so you can see the sort of Japanese reference here. And you can see the build-up of this sort of image. That's Abindranath Tagore, and it's highly nostalgic. You know, it does look towards the past, but you also see the flattening of space happening. So it's a kind of, it's a taking issue with academic realism as a style, but this style is being criticized because the style is seen as symbolic of a larger British presence and an attempt to dominate. So by changing the style and by taking on from, pre-British elements, that's part of the liberation, right? So, okay, you have Abindranath Tagore, you have some early Nandalal Bose. This is kind of Hindu myths. And please do notice that the Mughals are Muslim, right? So it's a Muslim reference. Hindu myths. Jagendranath Tagore, also part of this. So he's a lot more cubist. So even within something that is being called the Bengal school, you have, fractured little elements. It's not all as cohesive as history might have us believe. And you have Chuktai, and there's a particular reason I've chosen this image, because again, it's Holi, right? So Holi is the Hindu festival of spring. Chuktai is a Muslim, right? So you have Tagore, who is Hindu, belongs to Brahmo Samaj, depicting Mughal themes, and you have Chuktai depicting Hindu themes. Now, this is a narrative that in the run-up to independence is completely forgotten. So now here you have the word secular popping up again. And I would argue that actually the school is incredibly syncretic in the way that they're merging these different religions of the subcontinent. But the way in which the narrative has now been interpreted, you can see very quickly. You have Abindranath Tagore, who gets used in the run-up to nationalism as, having delineated Mother India. And this Mother India then is also picked up and continues to be picked up as a very Hindu-right version of Mother India. Why? Because she's wearing saffron. And so it's seen as quite an exclusive image, as a specifically Hindu image. But I don't think it was ever meant like that. And if you look at the sort of trajectory that I've shown you, they're looking at Mughal miniatures. So this is a narrative that happens post-independence as well. It's taken up, and it becomes Abindranath Tagore, the father of modern Indian art. And who becomes the father of modern Pakistani art? Chuktai. Right, so this is the who worships mother, and this is a Hindu right idea of Mother India, only orange, saffron. And Chuktai, Mughal princess. So, and Chuktai then becomes picked up within the Pakistani narrative as the father of Pakistani art. And this is the kind of image, the sort of very Mughal image that is remembered. And if you go to the sort of National Gallery of Modern Art in Delhi, you actually see quite a lot of Chuktais on Hindu themes. I've never actually been to that Lahore museum where Chuktai is, but I'm guessing that there aren't any Hindu themes there. And even if you sort of read Iftikhar Dadi, the major historian of contemporary Pakistani art, this is the kind of image he focuses on, right? The art of Muslim South Asia. So then our second phase of criticism, and we're speeding up now. The second phase of criticism is, of course, the Bombay school, and this is just post-independence, right? So just 1947, post-independence, you have the Bombay School forming the progressive artist group within Bombay. Bombay is a cosmopolitan, really cosmopolitan center of trade. Bombay, not Mumbai, at this point. And it's a melting pot for immigrants from all over India. And this group consists of different classes, different castes, different religions. And ironically, the two poster boys for this group, Hussein and Raza, are Muslim, right? And many of their family members went across to Pakistan, like Raza, whose brother went across. They didn't. And part of the reason they didn't, as we will see, was a complete commitment to the idea of the secular. But of course, they come into being, and the way they come into being is that they want to be modern Indian artists. Well, they want to be modern artists. And that means looking towards the West, but it also means looking towards tradition, as we'll see. And it means taking a big fight, or picking a big fight with the Bengal School of Art. So there are two main bugbears that the Progressive Artist Group founded by Sousa in 1947. And there are two things that Sousa is vitriolically critical of. One is academic realism, which he actually says is only for English memsabs playing with their chaprasis, which means maidservants. And then the second thing, of course, is the Bengal School of Art, who he says are sentimental, wishy-washy, and nostalgic pictures. I want neither of those. My art is going to be different. So the Progressive Artist Group 6 of them very male, especially, the first generation progressives, quite macho. I've recently discovered, in the research for the New York show, that there was a female who joined in the second wave of progressives, and she's been written out of everything. Primarily because she wrote herself out, because she felt that these guys were all going to starve, but she was a woman and she wanted to make a career for herself and earn proper money. So she went into fashion designing. And so she's really, really famous as the first Indian to have won an Oscar in 1982 for the film Gandhi, where she did all the costumes. And so if you, look up anything about her online, all you would find was references to Banu Attaya, the great costume designer. But she was also part of this crowd. But at this point, very male. And it's a very male aesthetic that comes out as well. And this is just a brief overview of who they were and the very close associates. This is fairly new research base for the show of actually identifying who belongs where, and digging out through the archives. And this is one image from the show. And this is Sousa, who's a beautiful writer, vicious writer. He's written things like Nirvana of a Maggot, talking about himself. And he sort of is very much the person who writes the manifesto of the group and defines it, in proper terminology, and picks the major battles. So it's usually Sousa you find criticizing, and he loves criticizing anything that goes before. And there's some amazing letters that have now come to light between Sousa and Hussein, between Sousa and Raza, and he fights with all of the progressive artists over the years. And, sleeps with their women, and there's all of this going on. But at the same time, he's very much the figure who has come to define because he wrote. And then I'm quickly going to show you 2 images to show you what I mean by when they might be fighting with one kind of tradition, but they're also drawing on another kind of tradition. And so you have Hussein here, and this is a fairly iconic Hussein. It's called Between the Spider and the Lamp. It became a stamp. And Hussein, I'm not going to go into why he's such a contentious artist and why he was chased out of India, but I am going to tell you that part of what he was looking at was this kind of Bashali painting, right? And this is something he actually says, that he's looking at the past, Bashali painting, Gupta sculpture, and what is this past? And Bashali painting comes from an area of India called Pahari school painting, and the Pahari school is from the Punjab hills, right? So it's right in the north. And this is an area that is identified with a very syncretic heritage. So when they're looking at the past, it's a specific syncretic kind of past that they're constructing, right? And this is for India. So Hussein might be Muslim, but that's his vision of India. Raza, also typically Muslim, but not looking at Mughal painting so much, again looking at Rajasthani painting. And he makes a work called Rajasthan, and you can actually see the sort of the colors and the lines. So this is the kind of tradition that they're looking at, even as they say they're breaking with tradition and the past. And then, of course, in 1971, you have another ruction that occurs, and that's the formation of Bangladesh. And in a way, when the British left, and after Cyril Radcliffe had drawn his bloody line, as it were, there's quite a lot of discussion about some of the papers that were exchanged between Nehru and the Mountbattens before they left. And of course, nobody is allowed to access those letters, but for, I think, many years at least. But there's there's suggestions that one of the things that was said in those letters is Mountbatten saying, don't worry, we've created a tent called Pakistan. It'll collapse soon and India can have it back. I don't know whether that's true or not. But certainly if you look at that map with India in the middle and a Pakistan completely split between the two, you could almost say with no language similarity and in India, stirring trouble both sides of the border quite happily, and a national narrative that is completely contestant to both of these, it was inevitable that there would be a problem. And so you have another split, and you have one of the progressive artists, Taib Mehta, talking about this very bloody split. And this happens in 71, as I said. And you have the last school that I'm talking about very fast, the Baroda School of Art, happening deliberately in the 80s with a new ideologue. And the new ideologue is art historian Geeta Kapoor. And she very much comes into being with another version of secular identity. And for her, the progressives didn't work, right? That idea of the modern obviously couldn't stop the communal tensions. And for her, she felt, well, why couldn't they do it? It's because the idea of the modern that they were working with was, and the idea of the secular, was too iconic. It was too universalist, possibly even too westernized in a particular way, and it wasn't translating to the ordinary man. And so you have the Baroda school coming into being in the 80s, picking up, criticizing the progressives, and coming up with their own aesthetic. And their own aesthetic also looks at the past. And so very fast, the three people who are very, very identified with that is Bhupen Khakkar, the first gay artist in India, explicitly so. And again, look at that. I mean, it's a very Muslim image. He's not Muslim. And these are the kind of low-key company school painting that he's looking at, the everyday man, not iconic image of man as symbol in the way that Hussein was doing it, but they were looking at the everyday guy, This was pre-globalized India, as it were. Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh, Muslim, again, very often talks about Kashmir quite a lot, and looking at Persian painting with Laila and Majnun, which is very much a Persian love story that often called the Persian Romeo and Juliet. But again, it's the everyday folk. So it's like taking traditional elements and bringing it to the everyday. Also very secular, right? If you look at what they're looking at. And here you have Nilima Sheikh referencing Kabir, who is a Sufi saint, but he's a Sufi saint that the Orthodox Muslims hated in the 14th century because he's not Orthodox, Sufi. Also that, the Hindu Orthodoxy really hated because he was a weaver and lower caste. And so it was, and this is a kind of reference. So this is what I mean by the everyday folk who are being referenced and given priority in this kind of Baroda school art. And lastly, just to say that, even though each school comes picking a fight with the one before, they're all looking at tradition. And actually, I would argue they're all looking at exactly this kind of bhakti, Sufi, secular, syncretic. So bhakti is a devotional aspect of Hinduism that is very much a folk. It's not orthodox. And Sufi is a very folk aspect of Islam. And in a lot of places, the Sufi shrines also double up for Hindu congregations. So it's all three schools have actually drawn on this heritage, despite what they say. And so just to say that each one of these guys, and this is why I will end, are looking at a specific kind of past. So even though you have the whole dialogue that modern Indian art and the modern art ruptures the past, in fact, it's specific aspects of the past that they're rupturing. And perhaps it's more in the dialogue around it than in actual fact that they're doing the rupturing. And so that's where I'm going to end.
Thank you, Zara. That's a lot. It's a good overview for us to get into our discussion today. And as I was listening, I was just, couldn't help but to also relate to some of the arguments in Southeast Asian art. When you're talking about Souza critiquing the Bengal school, that reminded immediately of Sojo Ono, in his establishment of Pasagi in 1937, critiquing the Mui Indies. So it seems that, the kind of language or narrative that we're looking at in modern art histories in India and, Southeast Asia, there are actually many similarities. So, perhaps we should also look at the structure of that narrative. And the next speaker is Tony. It's always good to have a philosopher in the room to help us sort through some of these things. And Zara's presentation, her important point about secularism, and she used the term, interestingly, multi-religious, as a way of drawing different religious traditions, right, in Indian culture. Tony will be looking more into nationalism and post-colonial imaginations, and we could, of course, extend that imaginations to imaginations of traditions. So, Tony, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kwok. I'm very happy and glad to be here today. I'm the only non-Indian here, so yeah, so there's a kind of a nervous, I'm a minority here in this context. Yeah, and I wouldn't say that I'm an art historian in presence of Zara. The talk was very impressive. Filled up a lot of gaps in my questioning, right? So I wouldn't say that I'm an expert on Indian art per se, because there's many experts around. But I would say at least that I'm a student of Indian art and I'm a lover of Indian philosophy. Okay, and what is my contribution here? My contribution here today is to consider part of my research project is to look at the interest of in terms of a human civilization, like certain common recurring patterns. I wouldn't go to the extent of being a structuralist, but I would say that time and again, when I observe, for example, the Singapore art scene, right? I used to work in LaSalle and NAFA and have friends in NTU. And when I look at from a broad overview, I don't have the details, but when I look at from the broad details, it seems like certain patterns and certain structures keep recurring itself. And this is perhaps my contribution today, right? To look at maybe to draw some resemblances and to maybe promote some discussion and to see, can we break out of these patterns, or should we just continue on with these patterns? And, is there any other possibilities around? Okay. So, so my talk today will be about the Bengal School of Art, okay, which Zara has done so pretty well. So it started in the Shantiniketan and the Kolkata area, and it's led by Abanindrana Tagore and E.B.H. Havel in Calcutta. And the works generated by him and his circle of friends. And its main aim is to develop Indian nationalism. So it's very sparked with this sort of tendency, right, to return to some kind of Indian essence. So notable artists of the Bengal school include Asit Halda, M.A.R. Chuttai, Sunayani Devi, and Shitandrana Majumdar. Okay, so when we look at the ideology of the Bengal school, we find that the Bengal art movement was a reaction against existing art styles, which is dominant in India. And so which art style, we need to know who are our enemies, right? I mean, for every philosopher, for example, Nietzsche would be against Hegel, right? Mao would be against capitalists and so on and so forth. So you know them better by their enemies. So what is the enemy of the Bengal School of Art, right? So Bengal School of Art is mainly the British colonial cultural art forms, and they saw it in terms of Raja Ravi Varma and the British art schools. So a lot of them wanted to break away, as the previous speaker has already mentioned. So they wanted to break away, and they saw it as the enemy, as something that they wanted to break away from and establish a new identity. So we find that in a lot of times in 20th century, from a philosopher's standpoint, right, a lot of art movements and social movements, especially in post-colonial one, wanted to sort of be anti-colonial or decolonialized, right? And I think this is a very important element in understanding 20th century art, where art and politics are very much intertwined. So you cannot look at, for example, art movements, the content that they choose, or the methodologies in which they approach on the rhetoric, if you want to call it rhetoric or narrative, in presenting their schools, without a consideration of the social, historical, political context in which you're in. So we find that one defining characteristic, be it the Nanyang style in Singapore, right, or in China or India, so a lot of them wanted to break away from the colonial forces. Okay, so Abanindranath Tagore looked at, so there was a turn away from European styles and a turn towards ancient murals and medieval Indian influences for inspiration, both for subject matter as well as indigenous material, such as tempera. As the previous speaker has also noted, right, in this breakaway, we find that already the beginning of a conceptual problem. It is not so much of a social, it's not so much a problem for the artist, but it's a problem from a philosophical standpoint, in a sense that the moment you define your movement in relation to, in terms of an opposition to some conceptual opposition to something else, in a sense you are already relying on that enemy that you are, I don't know whether you would agree, from art historian perspective. So philosophically and from a political philosophy standpoint, if the moment, like for example, in the history of Western political philosophy, Hobbes and Machiavelli in Italy and England, they would be defining themselves against a Catholic establishment, right? But in every page, if you read the Leviathan, almost every sentence, Catholicism is there. So in what ways did you break away from the Catholicism that you want to establish? So I think there's some universal patterns here, in the sense that when we look at it from this broad sort of human civilization perspective, you find that the Bengal School of Art, in its attempt to break away, or perhaps not to supplicate, right? Definitely not, but to break away from the past, in a way you rely very much on the past. And in fact, the more you deny it, the more you are reliant on the past, right? So that I think Deleuze would eventually in the 60s Deleuze and Guattari would call this some kind of a schizophrenic kind of in post-colonial modernities, right? I mean, in a sense that you love-hate your past. So whether you admit it or not, from the way I look at it, the Bengal School of Art, and not just pinpointing the Bengal School of Art, but in many art movements, even the Nanyang style and so-called Nanyang style, and until today it's very difficult to define Nanyang style, I mean, they would define it, and in the Singapore context, they will look at, some Indonesian women, and they will paint, and then the subject matter. So it's very difficult still to define it, because the art movement is defined in terms of via negativa, in terms of what it is not. And I think that's where the problem arises. So Abanindranath and Howell believe in returning to Mughal art. And I think at the back of my head, when I was looking at this, I was thinking, so how is Islam or the Muslim community in India involved in this? And I think the lecture was I was very impressed by the previous speaker, and it sort of filled in all the blank spots in my critical studies, right? So Abanindranath and Havel looked into Mughal art, and there were a lot of objections against them. But the Tagores actually supported this, right? And so perhaps my previous supervisor, Tagore, has written an article on cosmopolitanism. So there's different forms of nationalism involved, I think today in academia, a lot of sociologists and historians, when we talk about the term nationalism, we always think of Benedict Anderson, right? Imagined community, that's a standard. I mean, if you are undergraduate, you need to read the text. But we realize, that in fact there are many forms of nationalism, right? So it needs to be brought up. So in India, this sense of nationalism has many characteristics, but the main characteristics is that at that time, the Tagores and Havel wanted to develop mainly the sense that India has a spiritual inner tradition, which is opposed to Western materialist traditions, okay? So they find that this promises and develop a pan-Indian nationalism, which is distinct from the pan-Asian identity assumed by the West. So this is actually published recently, relatively recently, by Partha Chatterjee. You can look at the article, very interesting, called Whose Imagined Identity? So in this article, the point is that, in fact, the Bengal School of Art make a distinction between a pan-Indian kind of nationalism and a pan-Asian kind of nationalism, which is envisaged by the British. So, and I think this is very interesting philosophically, because sometimes in Singapore, we sometimes think that, hey, we are Asians and all, and then we have to establish the Asian identity. Then we question, what is the Asian identity? When in fact, there's no such thing as a homogeneous Asia, and the number of territories, languages, cultures, traditions, which you homogeneously define as Asia is in fact pretty much a colonial kind of invention. So in that sense, the Bengal School of Art and Tagore actually is pretty advanced in their, in their intellectual rumination. So because even in 21st century, as many people are wondering, what is the Asian identity? The Tagores are already wondering and already telling you that, hey, the Asian identity is a colonial construct. In many ways, we need to go back to a more rooted kind of pan-Indian identity. And in fact, to even have an Indian identity is a challenge, because I think there's many languages, many districts, and what do you mean by Indian is already a problem, right? And then I think in the independence, right? During the independence, right? The Muslim Indian was separated, right? In this sense. So I find that this is kind of important in understanding the Bengal School of Art. Okay. So the common enemy would be, Raja Ravi Varma, right, Saraswati, and you can see in it what we would call in art history as a kind of realism, right? But it's also you can find that in many of the paintings, it's a realism. If you come from a slightly more leftist angle, you will see that it's a realism that sort of promotes some kind of the upper class, upper status, and you might not want to call it class, you might want to call it caste kind of representations, okay? So contrast it with this painting by Tagore, which previously we've seen already. We find that I see in it a kind of attempt to move closer to the common people in order to attempt to reunite and to reach some kind of solidarity with the people and to establish some kind of identity. But of course, the interpretation of this painting, right, the Bharat Mata, Mother India as a representation of India, has been interpreted as a Hindu goddess. And I find that this could be problematic for a Muslim Indian or Indian Muslim kind of perspective. So from a philosophical, theoretical standpoint, you might sort of have certain, arrive at certain axioms or principles about nationalism and human civilization. And particularly in 20th century, is that in the 20th century, it seems that many movements, and not just art movements, but social political movements, usually define themselves in terms of via negativa against a tradition. But that's only the first point, because identity politics is always about defining against the other group. But identity politics has always a second principle. Do you want to know that? And that's my contribution for today. Identity politics has a second element, and that second element seems to be a negation of what you consider to be the other or the minority. And that minority could be another, another race. And that minority could be the gender, all right? That minority could be class or caste. So it seems like many social movements, so I look at it from a social movement perspective, so it seems like many social movements in the 20th century developed in reaction against some dominant movements in order to establish some kind of identity. But in establishing that identity, they found it necessary to define it against some other identities within their own community. And that's where the problem arises. And when they actually decide, and sometimes it's pretty arbitrary when you look at it from a psychological kind of a standpoint, right? So when they define it against a certain minority, and could be a gender, and 20th century we see a lot of feminist movements arising to voice out, right? You create problems which will spill over and then create other problems. So you find you have another movement. So a little bit, let's go back to the art history bit, right? So Bengal art movements, in attempting to reject British colonial influence, move towards a lot of East Asian art, right? So a lot of times they learn from Okakura, Kakuzo. So we have Nihon, and his preference for Nihongi paintings and Chinese paintings. So a lot of the paintings later on come to have a very East Asian aesthetics, right? So, but the attempt is always to establish some kind of identity. But you can always argue, right? The problem here lies is that when you return to East Asian aesthetics, right? Isn't there another colonial process at work? I mean, this is an invited colonialism, if you want to really push the discussion further, right? So it seems like no tradition can exist in a vacuum of its own, and every tradition must learn from or incorporate some other tradition. So it's a matter of which tradition you borrow from. So in other words, there's no pure blood in art movements, and also there's no pure blood in social political movements, as much as political movements want to market themselves. And when you find that, I mean, the same thing happened with the Nazis, right? I mean, in the 1930s. So the Bengal art movement believed that they could steer Indian art away from European influences, and they really turn to ancient cave paintings, Ajanta, and Hindu art paintings. But again, the question of what is Hinduism is very much contested in Indian philosophy, because at a certain point in time, there was no. When you go back further, there's no such thing as Hinduism. There was a Brahmanic tradition, there's a sannyasi tradition, there was the Buddhist tradition, there was the Samkhya yoga tradition, and I think they would find it problematic if we define them as Hindu. So Hindu is pretty much a post-19th century kind of construct, and when we look at British involvement, right, in Indian culture, we begin to wonder, to what extent is Hinduism representative of what India originally is, right? But I think one way out of this is to celebrate diversity and difference, and I find it in 1960 post-structuralist thought, which is that every attempt to establish some kind of identity, you create problems of wanting to exclude another group. Why not, instead of excluding, you engage in a project of inclusion, right? Including difference, and and to treat your identity as a nominal concept rather than an essential concept. So in that sense, you can really relook at what are the fundamentals of the Western and maybe Asian Enlightenment, which is equality, justice, and certain human rights, and inherent human dignity, which I find is very interesting, which is universal and can be found in various social political art movements, right? So you cannot escape any of these principles when you want to organize. It is when these principles are slowly dissolved or erased that society breaks apart. Okay. So I wanted to talk about several post-colonial perspectives, as I shared with Kenchao last night. I have about 10 pages, but we only have 15 minutes, so I'll just quickly look at Homi Bhabha's, return to Homi Bhabha. Yeah, some of you want to. Yeah, Homi Bhabha's concept of post-colonial Orientalism. It is basically a kind of a constructed ideas, right? So basically, I'm dealing with identity politics here. So it's basically a kind of Orientalism is a kind of a constructed idea by the West initially of how the East is like, right? And there's a very good book about this. It's called The Asian Mystique, okay? Because I used to do cultural studies and sociology and intertwine the two. And, it shows you how, from a Western perspective, from a Western ocular-centric perspective, how the Asians are viewed, right? So Asian women are viewed as either exotic or very dangerous, right? Men are usually associated with kung fu and some spirituality or something like that, right? So it's very interesting. So, so from Edward Said's perspective, right, Orientalism is what Westerners think of Asians, right? And to cut the long story short, because I only have about maybe one minute left, right? It's the idea that, you know, these are not, as Foucault say, this knowledge are not value neutral. Knowledge are very often politically inclined to establish or to maintain the status quo. And I find that, you know, the feminist movement in the 20th century really pushed this very far, and there's a lot of work in this, how knowledge itself is not gender, class, ethnic, race neutral, but everything is political in a sense. So you just need to open, you know, your third eye or something, you know, or to relook at what you consider to be knowledge. And in fact, it is not knowledge but propaganda. Okay. So I will leave with some questions, and you know, what were some of the sources of Indian nationalism in the Bengal School of Art? You know, so at that time they had no resource except British European sources and you know, a School of Art in Paris. But of course, they could look at ancient art, but then you enter a conundrum, a catch-22, whether you are parochial Indian or you are international, in which case you are seen as the colonial. So they're stuck. Right? So what were the theoretical assumptions? And I think it's pretty much Western, and even nationalism, the concept of nation itself is already Western, right? And it has something to do with the French Revolution. So did they manage to form distinct pan-Asian identity? Probably, you know, for a short while, but you know, things sort of become, you know, there were fractures within this pan-Indian identity. Women were excluded, you know, in this discussion, and you can find this similar structure of excluding women in, you know, is there any Nanyang people around? Yeah. So they were not excluded, but they were sort of marginalized, put at the side. Well, the main Nanyang people were male. So I find that this seems to be happening in every social organization, in every society. A specific group may not be women today, it could be men another day, but it's very interesting, you know, you could call this what Bataille called the accursed share. So there's always a sacrificial group in society that is always cast out. And you can find this also in, I'm not saying that the Bengal School of Art is doing this, but I'm saying in every group there seems to be a minority. Okay? So what were the issues in adopting nationalist agenda? I would say that this is a paradox of the post-coloniality, in the sense that when you're against the colonial, much of you is still colonial. It's like how, you know, the Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao, against the nationalists, against the capitalists, became more totalitarian in the end, right? And then there you have the Chinese Cultural Revolution. So how do we break out of it? How do human civilization break out of this kind of structure? Should we break out of this structure? And how do we break out of this structure? This is a perennial human problem. So was the post-colonial project successful? I think we need to decolonize, be post-colonial, be anti-colonial, but I think one way out is to be mindful of the past and to really re-examine the past in order to make the future possible. Because every attempt to ignore the past repeats the past in a different guise. That's my philosophical contribution for today. Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Indeed, when Rabindranath visited China in the 1930s, immediately the Chinese cultural community was separated into two groups of people who were for Tagore and people who were against Tagore. So every time when there's such an opportunity, it becomes a kind of identity sorting through, you know, for people to voice out for or against. And it becomes an opportunity of stating a certain position, and art history is very much written that way. So thank you very much, Tony, for your explanation in helping us to see the language of art history. Now, Rabindranath Tagore, of course, the Nobel laureate, was actually the uncle of Rabindranath Tagore, but they were only really 10 years apart, so that they could be regarded as the same generation. And they were, of course, doing artwork together and so on, in contributing to the discourse of modernity in Indian art. In the next speaker, we have SMU distinguished business school professor, who is also an art collector. And we'll be talking about how Jamini Roy, Rabindranath Tagore, and also Himan Mazumdar were actually active in Calcutta, but were looking at things fairly differently from the Bengal school. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All right, ladies and gentlemen, here we are. I'm going to say first one thing as a caveat. I've never had a course in art history in my life, okay? So I know nothing about art history. But I am an academic, and as an academic, I believe in disagreement, debate, as a way to advance knowledge. I'm going to disagree with many of the things said previously, but also, first thing I'm going to disagree with is there's anything called the Bengal School of Art. So I'm going to start with Calcutta and Indian modern art, because I just don't know what Bengal School of Art is unless somebody explains it to me with the use of some kind of, what you call false narrative, okay? So I'm going to do that. The thing we have to remember is, because much of it was said before what I was going to cover, so I'm going to go quickly, is that, you have to remember that the British came to India looking for what they considered was a higher culture. But when they reached there, it was the East India Company. Christopher Columbus went the wrong way looking for India, but this was looking for India, the cultural zenith of that time. And when they reached India, they were actually quite humble and sympathetic towards the Indian idea and India itself. Not that there was a country called India, but there was this land called India, right? But what happened was, once the 1857 First War of Independence took place, they realized that now the government has to take over, and B, they have to repress the country. So then came this feeling that there was nothing great about India, because you have to conquer their mind before you conquer their body. And so here you have a professor of Sanskrit from Oxford University saying not a single large painting or nor beautiful statue is to be seen throughout India. Right? You have the second guy, the official handbook of the Victoria and Albert Museum in 1880, the monstrous shape of Puranic duties unsuitable for the highest form of artistic representation. And this is possibly why sculpture and painting are unknown as fine arts in India. I assume they've never encountered a Chola dynasty bronze of the 12th century, right? Or the Pala dynasty of the 11th to 12th century, or the Taj Mahal. I have to assume that all of this was in the absence of these encounters, right? But, the British decided that, in our benevolence, we should establish an institution, and they established the Government College of Art to teach people, because there's no fine arts education in India, teach people. And this institution has been established by a benevolent government for the purpose of revealing to the Indians the superiority of European art. Okay, that's the whole reason for it being established. And of course, some second-tier academic from UK is sent to be the principal of this, because the top-tier guys are teaching in the UK. They're not going to come to India, right? And Calcutta, of course. So some second-tier person is sent over there, and there we have several of these second-tier principals until comes along and then they're looking for this person who will embody this European. And so the search is for an Indian artist who could depict the old age Indian themes with all the powers of European art. And so they find this Bollywood painter before Bollywood called Raj Ravi Verma. You can see his painting. This tend to be the kind of posters you see of movies. And basically there's no third dimensionality to it. There's nothing that's modern in this modern art. I'm a collector. So as a collector's perspective, I look at this. I say, what's modern about this modern art? Right? So this cannot be modern art. But in the meantime, in 1896, when E.B. Howell comes to the Government College of Art, he basically says Indian painting must become Indian in its attitude, execution, and spirit. And he finds a kindred spirit in him in Abhindranath Tagore. Okay? Now, Abhindranath Tagore comes from this Tagore family of Jarasanka. They are basically the Brahmins of Calcutta. They think they're superior to everybody else until they have to encounter the Tam Brahms from the south, but they don't meet many of them. Anyway, so basically these guys, decide that we will go back to something that's Indian. And what do they go back to? What was there before the British? It was the Ajanta caves and the Mughal art. So they end up with this kind of painting of Abhindranath Tagore. As you can see, 1905, when he becomes the principal, he banishes all academic realism. If you're an academic realist painting, you're banished. You're unpatriotic, right? Instead, you paint this. Now here is a Bengali guy, he's signing his name in Persian, he's painting Mughal art, he has this weak line, he has these muted colors, he has the wash technique. If you want to see a mess of a painting, these are two. okay? And these paintings belong to me, so I can say whatever I feel like. All the paintings I will show today all belong to me, so I can critique them as much as possible because they're my paintings. I own them. Then he's gone the Mughal way. Along comes Nandlal Bose, his most famous and illustrious student, and probably the weakest of all artists of that era. And here is his paintings again. You may see some modern art in here. All these three paintings belong to me. I know Katrina, my co-author, loves the one in the middle. Of course, that is a very realistic woman, so of course I understand why you would love it. But, I mean, what is this crap, This is what we call modern Indian art. Then I don't want any modern Indian art in my collection. Okay. The third guy is Gagendranath Tagore, as they mentioned. He is actually the most interesting of the three. Though the Nandlal Bose's family has been very good at marketing him because they have a huge hoard of his paintings, so they managed to market him as the best and increase his prices, but he's the weakest. This guy is actually more interesting, but nobody has a control of his painting, so of course he's not marketed as well. And here are three, you can see from the middle painting, which is a young Rabindranath Tagore, that he is a very accomplished painter. But being a great painter doesn't make you a great artist, unfortunately. So, and that one at the corner is these cartoons he used to do. That one is from my collection, which was shown both at the Tate Britain and as the National Gallery of Singapore. So this is what we call the old Bengal school. It deserves to be consigned in the dust heap of Indian art. Then there is our friend Hemen Mazumdar. He has been ostracized by the Tagores. He's been told, you're not allowed anywhere near us or Indian art. The Bauhaus exhibition takes place in 1921. He's not even allowed to display a painting. So he forms with Jamni Roy and Atul Bose a different society called the Indian Fine Arts Society. And he basically says the inability of the Bengal school to draw is camouflaged by their assertion of a spiritual world beyond appearances. I think this captures it beautifully, right? And he believes in academic realism, but he's trying to capture a kind of woman who's been forgotten. So his way of being patriotic is different from other. The woman is the one untouched part of British India because she's secular. And he's told also with his paintings, you can see, unlike Raja Ravi Verma, it is academic realism, but he has the third dimension, which Raja Ravi Verma. You can look at this painting and you can think for a long time, what is she thinking about? What is the condition of this woman? What is in her head? What is in her mind? That's what makes, until I can see the third dimension, I don't have modern art. Because so this is, him, but he is still stuck. And his great contribution is he's representing these upper class Indian women who are basically unseen. You have to remember, the women who are prisoners in India at that time are not the poor women. They are allowed to go out. They have to go out to work, to collect, do groceries, do all of this thing. It's the upper class women who are the real prisoners. Because once they get married, they enter the household, except on festivals and on weddings, they never come out. And this painting, the expectation, shows it beautifully. Her entire contact with the outside world is when her man goes out and returns in the evening to tell her what happened. That's it. That's her connection to the outside world. This is a beautiful painting that captures that. And he is, of course, a great artist, as you can see from the sculptural qualities of this. One of the things people keep talking about is fakes in Bengal school. There are no fakes. There are only fake authenticators and fake people with fake eyes, right? You want to fake this quality of painting? Please try it for me. If you could paint like this, Indian art and Indian artists are not that deep that we have artists of this quality who will chart a faking career instead of their own careers. Look at the flesh movement, right? Look at the turn of that sari. Look at those hips. I mean, the problem is people don't look. So we have a lot of art history, people who study art history, but they don't study with their eyes. And first you have to look at a painting, then study the art history part. Because until you can see, that's what art is all about. What do I feel when I see a painting? Do I feel the movement, right? And he was the first one who started these wet sari paintings. He started Bollywood's wet sari scenes before Bollywood discovered them. And you see here, this way he treats this painting is absolutely impossible. The problem is, Jamni Roy joined with him in 1920, but within 2 or 3 years, he broke away from Hemen Mazumdar. And his argument was very simple. He said, it's not possible for me to paint in a European way, nor in a Chinese or the Tibetan, or to follow the Persian or Mughal painting was similarly difficult for me because I'm not from the milieu. So we are still searching for the first Indian modern artist. And so he goes back to his tradition, which is the Kali Ghat and the patuas. And basically, the Indian art is very different from academic realism. It's a flat. It's no perspective in many ways. There's no light and play of light and depth. Right? It's a single line very quickly made, and you quickly fill the plane with color. So this is a classic Kali Ghat painting, which would be painted over and over again by the same artist standing outside the Kali Ghat. And basically, it's a very common scene of a cat running after a little lobster. And he absorbs this and transforms that into his two cats, who represent the Hindu priests who claim they are vegetarian, but behind the scenes, they're fighting over the Bengali delicacy of shrimp. You see their sly eyes. You see their bodies puffed up in self-importance. You see their tails erect in arrogance. In their bodies, they may be separate, but in their minds, they're fused in avarice and greed. This is modern Indian art. But the problem with all conceptual artists is, in the end, the same. Once you get the concept early in your career, do you evolve or do you become repetitive? And this is the challenge for all conceptual artists. Some, like Subodh Gupta, will never solve it. Others try, right? So here you see the same drummers, 1920s. This is from the Archer collection, a painting that I bought from the Archer's son. It's in his book, India and Modern Art. It's the drummers in 1920s, their 20s, late 30s, late 40s. You see the evolution. In the end, he says, all I want my picture is to look different. The same evolution you see here. The flat technique, 1920s, late 20s, late 40s. You see, there's a three-dimensionality, there's a movement. He's figured out to be in the flat technique so that it's against academic realism, against the Western, but get the three-dimensionality with the way he was using the frame and everything. But the problem is, he's still stuck to painting Indian subjects. He's not a modern artist as yet. So the question is, how do you become a modern artist? You should be able to paint anything with your style and make it your own. So he decides, I'm going to paint the Christian themes. And they've been painted for 2,000 years before me. How can you make the Last Supper your own? Paint the Last Supper, 12 men around a table with Jesus, stay true to the flat technique, and make it unique. You see, the walls are closing in. We know there is ominous, there's treason in the air. We don't know who the traitor is. Right? He brilliantly captures the feeling of the Last Supper while staying true to his technique. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go. And his evolution of a mother and child, which he painted for 50 years, that's the last mother and child he painted. He said, to paint a mother, you need to capture two attributes, strength and love. If you miss one attribute, it's not a mother. And in the last picture, with 6 strokes, he captures a mother and child, both strength and love. And as Lao Tzu, the famous Chinese philosopher, said, if you want knowledge, add one thing each day. If you want wisdom, remove one thing each day. And that's Jamni at his peak. And when I did the show of Jamni Roy at Nehru Center, I had M.F. Hussain open it. He came. And you know what he said? This will be of interest to the audience. When Hussain opened the exhibition, he said, I came only today because of Jamni Roy. He was truly the father of Indian modern art. And for Hussain to have the magnanimity to say that tells you what he thought of Jamni Roy. And he said, I only came for Jamni Roy. And this is my good friend who unfortunately passed away. I loved him very much, Harvard Hodgkin, who said, there is a special relationship between the identities of modern and Indian, which is uniquely tied to the historical moment. Jamni Roy's paintings was modern because he created a new and distinct style, and it was Indian because of his technique and his conception. I'm going to end with 3 slides now. And the last 3 slides are of Rabindranath Tagore. Rabindranath Tagore was the first non-European, non-white guy to win a Nobel Prize. He won it for literature. At the age of 60, he said, after winning the Nobel Prize for literature, there are some things I can't express in words. And he starts painting. And his thing is, I strongly urge our artists vehemently to deny their obligation carefully to produce something that can be labeled as Indian art according to some old world mannerism. Let them proudly refuse to be herded into a pen like branded beasts that are treated as cattle and not as cows. And he said, I'm Indian, I'm modern, anything I paint is modern Indian art. And his paintings take a third view. Rather than academic realism, rather than folk art like Jamni as the basis, his is an expressionist art. And here are two paintings that I'm very fortunate to possess. One is a cover of a book that he painted, which was called Khap Chara. Khap Chara in Bengali means without face, right? That's Khap Chara. And you see how he captures. And the second is from the Elmer's collection, which is basically, the problem with Tagore was always his sister-in-law commits suicide shortly after, Kadambari commits suicide shortly after he gets married because she was in love with him. And since then he was haunted. His poems, his paintings, his writings, his songs, all of them, you don't know who he's singing to, himself, God, or his lover. And it's the same thing with his paintings. There's an expression, there is a deep, depressing, dark feeling about Tagore and that melancholy that stays around him throughout his life. So that's really my presentation. I'm trying to make up the time. Thank you very much.
So I mentioned at the beginning about the title of the National Gallery show, Decorations and Dreams. And I believe that we have actually also moved through that, first by the notions and concepts of movements, and then we're looking at dreams in terms of concrete artworks, in the case of Rabindranath Tagore. And the university established Vishva Bharati. Understand that it also means something like Indian communication with the world, that there was a new sense of thinking about India and also India in the context of the world at large. So this is also about modernity. It is also about nationalism, but not understood in any simplistic way. Now we're moving on to Baroda. And Priya, thank you very much for being here. We now move to another part of India and slightly later in time, perhaps, right? Or not, maybe. Contesting that, therefore, that there is a local history to art history, art creation, and collection, even within Baroda. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon. And thank you, Kenshaw, for having all of us here. Thanks, Zara, Tony, and Nirmalya for those very engaging presentations, which in a sense sets the premise for the Baroda School. Just nice that Kenshaw mentioned that Baroda School is a later development in modern Indian art. So I will begin this presentation by contesting just that. Let me begin with these two landmark publications which capture the story of modern and contemporary art in Baroda. As you can see, one was published in 1975 and the other in 1997. Now, what these two publications do is to essentially tell you that the story of modern art in Baroda is a post-independence phenomenon. So they're really situating the story of modern art around 1950. And why 1950? Because this is the year in which the Faculty of Fine Arts is instituted in the Baroda University. And the careers of the Faculty of Fine Arts and the story of modern art are closely intertwined. So to that extent, the authors are right. However, personally, as a scholar who studies Baroda through the colonial period, this becomes very problematic. And so I got together with the previous two authors and another 10 contributors to bring together this edited volume in 2015. And what this does is to present a much longer history of Baroda's art and visual cultures, which, to put it differently, actually pushes back the story of Baroda's modern art on the timeline, right? So what we were doing while working on this volume is to be very mindful of the fact that there is an earlier story of a princely modernity, which starts out in the reign of a very, very progressive Maharaja, Sayajirao Gaikwad, who came to the throne in 1875. Now, he has been regarded as one of the most progressive of all Maharajas of the 629 princely states that we had. He has been profiled as a crusader for women's rights, healthcare issues, civic awareness, and so on and so forth. But of course, what is of interest to us, what is relevant to us, is his role as a collector of the arts and as a very frequent and active lender to exhibitions worldwide. So to give you a sense of his collecting activity and his role as a lender to exhibitions, whether these exhibitions were in Calcutta, Bombay, Paris, or London, what the Maharaja was essentially doing is looking at specimens of high art, so the likes of Raja Ravi Varma. I will meet you outside Nirmalya to settle that score between Hemen Majumdar and Ravi Varma. But the Maharaja was also collecting Nandalal Bose and European artists. So you have oil paintings, you have specimens of craft, whether it's silverware, ivory work, traditional weaves, contemporary weaves. So there are lots of artisanal or craft specimens. And he also has an appetite for experimental produce that comes out of the vocational and technical schools in his state. To sort of turn or to change or modify that same pie chart a little bit, what we're really looking at is that here is a collector who's sourcing artworks from the studios of high artists. He's going to the artisans, the guilds, or the market, and at the same time, he's also sourcing and collecting from the state's polytechnics. So I want to pause here and draw your attention to the fact that here is a princely paradigm of art, a sign of early modernity, which is extremely inclusive. It is very, very cosmopolitan. So unlike Bengal in the 1890s, which is premised on rejection, throwing out or banishing, as Nirmalya says, banishing the European. This is different. It starts out with a deeply cosmopolitan imagination, right? And this cosmopolitan idea, what it does is to encourage a crossing of boundaries, to erase the boundaries between art and craft, between the studio and the guild, between the traditional and the modern. And to me personally, it is this cosmopolitan imagination set out in princely Baroda which really gives a cue to the Faculty of Fine Arts, which comes into being in 1950. And the same princely modernity and cosmopolitan imagination sets the direction for Baroda's modern art, which we will see is extremely inclusive, secular, and this is another connotation of the word secular, and egalitarian. So let's see what we have here. If Tagore's Shantiniketan was premised or was, if it emphasized a traditional or a revivalist slant, if the progressive artists group that Zara spoke about nurtured this modernist image of a free-thinking social rebel, and if you had colonial art school models in other parts of the country, I tell you, Baroda started out as a clean slate. There was never a mandate, a guideline, or a blueprint for the new Faculty of Fine Arts that came into being in 1950. It could just take off on its own without any recorded document of art education. And so, in such a climate, it could quite freely borrow from different art school models and different ideologies, so that it could borrow from the vernacular crafts, It could borrow from the post-Bauhaus American school, the British art school model, and a lot of other ideologies, techniques, media, and materials were all assembled on a single campus. One of the other reasons for this very cosmopolitan imagination of the curriculum at the school was also the fact that you had a literal influx of artists, educators, and practitioners from many different parts of the country, and that continues to be the case with Baroda. And the first among them, or one of the pioneer art educators was N.S. Bendre, who came in from Bombay to Baroda, and he represents the first 2 decades, the 1950s and 60s, when artists began to engage with international modernism, be it cubism, abstraction, or such like. Now, Zera's raised a very important point about being jammed between borrowing or deriving from a Western school and or borrowing from an Indian tradition. So there seems to be this very erroneous view that artists such as Bendre, or generally Indian modern art, is about bringing together Indian subject matter, Indian content, and a Western style. But we will analyze this work to see that the process clearly goes beyond that superficial marriage between Indian subject and Western style or form. So if we look at this early work by Bendre, which was painted in Baroda, you have a female nude, and there are multiple flexions of the body, multiple flexions in the torso and the limb, and the body is arranged almost in spirals, which actually lends itself exceptionally well to the Cubist language and Cubist method of handling the human form. Where does Bendre get this female nude? From medieval Indian temple iconography, where this image of a celestial nymph or an apsara is exceptionally common as she turns around to remove the thorn from her foot. In terms of the planes that you have in the background, the receding and protruding planes, again, Bendre borrows from indigenous iconography so that you have these goddesses associated with fertility cults, and you see the semblance of the tree in Bendre's painting, the branch, and the leaves. So there are a lot of motifs that are coming from Indian or indigenous iconography. And in terms of the color palette, what Bendre does is to depart from standard cubism. So for those of us who know, standard cubism always works with low-key colors. But the Basoli and the Bundi school manuscript paintings that Zera showed us had these bright reds and yellows. And you see a similar palette in Bendre's works. And the way in which he does the tonal gradation of the red or the yellow, you have a lot of art historians who analyze this to tell you that Bendre cultivated a feel for the Indian sunshine, the tropical sunshine or light. So you have elements of indigenous iconography and an indigenous palette, which is constantly mediating cubism. So there is no borrowing or deriving from cubism as it is. Very quickly, we move to Bendre's foremost pupil, Professor Ratan Parimo, who also emerged as an artist in his own right, but I'm going to here talk about his contributions towards an art history curriculum that came about in the same faculty at Baroda University. So you have an art history curriculum that again works on the principle of inclusion. You're not entirely Eurocentric. The curriculum is not entirely nationalist, but it has a very wide and a very self-reflexive thrust to it. And at the same time, Parimo was building an archive, this huge repository of images that would lend themselves to conducting the art history lessons, as well as the images to be available to these artists who were in the making. And this is what really distinguishes the Baroda school from, let's say, Bengal or Bombay, because you have a very different and a very tightly integrated model where the production of modern art or art practice is tightly linked with art history and archive building, so that you have an empirical and an archival basis to the thinking and production of what modern art should be. From there, a look at K.G. Subramanian, who interestingly comes from Shantiniketan to Baroda, and his principle that guides the ethos of modern art in the 60s and 70s in particular is to look towards living traditions. And by living traditions, he meant be it embroidery, wall painting, mural, ceramic, and such like. So Subramanian actually emerges as a very sought-after role model on the Baroda campus. And what he did is once again to encourage students to cross boundaries between art and craft, between the studio and the outdoor, pretty much like what the Maharaja was doing in his own time, breaking down these hierarchies, subverting these hierarchies between materials and medium. Now, he himself dabbled in a whole range of materials and media, which we do not have the time to go into, but I shall talk about this move in terms of looking towards living traditions through this single mural, which incidentally adorns the building that houses the Faculty of Fine Arts on the Baroda campus. And so it's one of the most recognizable landmarks on campus and generally in Baroda city. The way in which Subramanian worked on this particular mural, and of course a whole lot of others across the country, was by collaborating with a traditional mural artist from Rajasthan, who was also officially a teacher in the Faculty of Fine Arts. So the 60s and 70s also sees a rise in the appointment of traditional artisans within the faculty to be able to think through what this new modern art should be. So the way in which the traditional mural artists, Yarsilal Varma and Subramanian, went about working is to engage with locally available materials in a very extempore manner, so that they could be working with cement at a factory site or locally available clay. And of course, they delighted in the process, which would then yield the relief, the surface, and the structure of this mural. So we do understand that relief, structure, surface all refer to the formalist concern in modern art. So you're looking at a traditional technique, which is mural. You're looking at experimental materials, and you're trying to arrive at a new language, new formalist concerns in the making of a modern art. And actually, taking a cue from Subramanian, you had a whole generation of artists in Baroda who left the coveted genre of oil painting and moved to printmaking. And I think this was in the interest of showing more social and political realities. The artists became concerned with communal tensions, with feminist issues, and with homosexual themes, and all these different concerns that were basically facing society. So I'd like to use Ghulam Sheikh's works, whose career again straddles art history and art practice. He taught art history at the department, and he also emerges as one of the most successful modern and contemporary artists from Baroda. And I want to look at this landmark work, City for Sale, which was produced in the early 1980s. It really is a comment on the communal tension and rioting that builds up in the city in 1980s in Baroda. If you look at this image, seemingly it is fragmented and it gives you a very cubist sort of structure. However, the intention and the aspiration of the artist is very anti-cubist. Because again, in standard cubism, the individual fragments have no meaning. But here, they're very rich in narrative and in detail, and they're telling you a story. One of the other things that Sheikh does is to adopt the multiple entry points and multiple perspectives that you see in manuscript painting, whether Mughal, Basoli, Bundi, Pahari, or whatever. So he works closely with these multiple entry points because he thinks that they lend themselves very well to bring out the local meaning. But here they're very rich in narrative and in detail, and they're telling you a story. One of the other things that Sheikh does is to adopt the multiple entry points and multiple perspectives that you see in manuscript painting, whether Mughal, Basoli, Bundi, Pahari, or whatever. So he works closely with these multiple entry points because he thinks that they lend themselves very well to bring out the local environment in India and the Indian experience, which is polymorphic, the mobile quality of life, and so on and so forth. So at any given point in time, there is a heavy manipulation of perspective going on in this work. You get an aerial perspective of the city down there, the right-hand corner. You sometimes have an elevated perspective, and you can see things going on in the interior as well as the outside of these buildings. Now, amidst all this aggressive searching of identities by mobs and the killing that is going on, the city, at the center, you have a commercial artist who's painting the hoarding of a major blockbuster Bollywood film called Silsila. And what the artist is doing is basically completing the eye of the lead actress. Now, for those of us who understand the South Asian tradition of sacred images and icons, painting that eye is the last most important act where you breathe life or soul into an inanimate figure. And that's exactly what the artist is doing, breathing life into the actress's face, which stands in contrast to all the killing and writing that is going on around. But a fellow artist called Geev Patel, who Zahra mentioned, interprets this rather well and says that probably it's the artist's last hope for resurrection in, amidst all this violence and fanatic behavior that is underway. So once again, with this, I want to say that the artist's prime concern is the formalist structure. There is no deriving or borrowing or copying from Cubism or other international schools of modernism. There is a very, very strong connection with indigenous visual cultures, whether it's manuscript painting or which in the case of K.G. Subramanian was mural art, ceramics, etc. And with that, I will conclude the talk to say that, of course, Baroda's modern art quite clearly forged ties with international movements such as Cubism and abstraction, but there was a very conscious and a very willed sort of move towards also locating themselves in a long lineage of indigenous and visual cultures so that Baroda does not work on a principle of rejection. There's always this idea of including the foreign and the local, the indigenous and the modern, and there's a commingling of the high and the low. And of course, in this process, both princely Baroda and the Faculty of Fine Arts, with their very, very cosmopolitan imaginations and conditions, themselves become agents of modernity. And Baroda's modern art is not just a story that is situated in the 1950s or the 70s or 80s. I think there are multiple narratives at work. It starts out with the princely narrative. You have the archival, the pedagogical, the art historical, all very tightly intertwined to then give you a modern art school that celebrates the national based on the principle of inclusion or cosmopolitanism or secularism with another ring. So with that, I will conclude. Thank you.
I invite the panelists to come out. The wonderful thing about having a panel of Indian art experts is that there isn't any lacking of friendly fires. So let's get started. Well, please, anywhere, please, yeah. Okay. Hello. Now, we started a little bit late today, 15 minutes late. So if it's fine with you, we will also end 15 to 20 minutes late. But if you're not free, please feel free to leave. So we do have, can I confirm with the staff here that can we do it up to 5:20? Thanks. Okay. So let's get started. All right. First of all, Priya, you wanted to settle something with Nirmala. Why not do it here?
I said I would settle it outside.
No, do it here. Let's get started. Come. Okay. It's between Ravi Verma versus Heman, I believe, right? Okay, let's do that. Come.
Okay, maybe I'll make a plug for a particular chapter in my book, in my publication, and I discuss over there at length that how Ravi Verma, again, is not just simply looking at academic realism per se. He's actually bringing in a lot of vernacular traditions so that the way in which he paints the jewelry, there is a distinct Tanjore painting sensibility that he brings to it. He's undertaking this field work and all India field trips, which were actually sponsored by the Maharaja of Baroda, to be able to study these local types, different types within the nation. So there really is a project with a clear guideline where you are assembling different Indian types and you're working with different vocabularies, both European and indigenous. And then, of course, he brings with him the sensibility of the Indian performing arts, and he had participated in the dance style of Kathakali as a child, and he came from that tradition of recitation and performance. And I think you see those influences, especially in his mythological compositions. I will end with that and wonder what Nirmala has to say about Verma versus Heman.
I'm just going to leave it by saying that, Priya, you're much more knowledgeable about me. I thank you for educating me. And, I'm not going to engage in any more debate except to say, trust your eye.
Indeed. I mean, I'm saying that I absolutely like Majumdar's works as well, but I just think that the reference points are very different. And so obviously the product is likely to be different. You seem to be suggesting that Heman Majumdar is far superior than Verma.
As a painter, yes. As an artist, we can disagree because that's a matter of judgment.
So Zehra has just contributed an essay to the Heman Majumdar catalogue, and I'm wondering if she has anything to add.
Well, I mean, quite honestly, just to be not at all art historical, which is a completely separate definition. Because, Zizek once gave an interview when he was asked what it's like to write. And he said, I'm not a writer. You see, what I do is I make notes, and then after that I edit them. So the act of writing disappears. And in the same way, you can almost see, as a discipline, art history doesn't really exist, because each one of us came up and said, we're not really art historians. I said, oh no, I'm going to give you an overview and let's look at the politics. And Nirmala said he's a business person. So I mean, in this whole act of sort of art history is a kind of disappearing discipline, which is what makes it interesting, but also like just to be completely not art historical. I actually don't like Hemant Mazumdar as an artist. I just think, okay, so you can draw, and you can draw sexy women, and that's really great. And so, yeah, that's very skillful of you. Do I personally, as a woman, want to look at another woman's breast that up close? Not really. I'm not. That doesn't do it for me. So I almost think that sort of rating somebody's technical skill is a less interesting discussion than talking about how they fit into a wider narrative, particularly of the period. And maybe as a sort of little linker before we can open it up to more arguments, is the fact that, again, each one of us came on and dismantled the very idea that we were talking about. So if you say that there is no Bengal school, as it were, right? It is very much a contested concept. And in a sense, what is the Baroda school? As Sonal Kolar has written very beautifully about typical Baroda school artists, like Bhupen Kakar, locating him in Bombay and arguing for a cosmopolitan heritage that is not from Baroda, but is actually a Bombay aesthetic, as she talks about it. So I think each school, as it were, can also be unpicked within itself. And the whole idea of looking at something closely means that you actually fracture the image, right? Which kind of comes back to what you were saying.
I come to you, Tony. Namaya said that, in your presentation, Hemant represented women of the high-class society, which otherwise would not be given a voice. There was no representation. Whereas Zera said, she's not, as a woman, she's not particularly impressed with that representation of women. So that's one question for you, as in, the representation of women. And the next thing that I'd like you to comment on is this idea of taste, because we are talking about very personal taste here coming in, using our eyes to look at. So is there such a thing as the kind of intersubjectivity, and do we arrive at a certain way of looking at art history, given that subjectivity? Yeah.
Thanks. Thanks. Ken Chow, I think the question concerns the academia in the last roughly 50 years, which has been what we call the postmodern, post-structuralist turn, and which basically tried to cut a very long French story short, is that there is no some kind of intersubjectivity, that all kinds of intersubjectivity is, in fact, subjectivities are reproduced in the system, like Foucault and Althusser would say, we would define ourselves as Chinese, Indian, or Singaporean, and we try to have this identity. But all this identity and even authenticity actually comes from the outside. So there's no inside and outside. So there's no such thing as subjectivity. So in the past 50 years, with this erasure of subjectivity, there's no some kind of intersubjectivity that we're talking about. But of course, this 60s movement, right, seems to be dying out. There seems to be, because it doesn't work, because it seems like everyone's view should be celebrated, and it seems to be democratic, but when you actually operate it on the ground, it actually leads to a lot of fascist and in a political sense, So democracy, when pushed to its extreme, becomes a kind of, it doesn't work, because you cannot have a collective decision. You need someone who knows their stuff and have the support of the rest. And so it doesn't work both philosophically and politically. So but personally, I think there's some kind of intersubjectivity. So there has to be some kind of, despite our ethnic differences, there's some kind of common ground that we need to come to it. About representation of women, I think, even if it's representation of women, I would see it as, there's a big difference between liberal feminism and post-colonial feminism. Because even if when I say that women are marginalized, I don't mean that they're totally absent. I mean that they are sort of represented in a certain ways, or marginalized in a certain ways. And in that case, women from a higher class are represented. So it's a total representation of class when I look at paintings.
I believe what you said about the kind of issue with intellectual development in the last several decades also is echoed also in the museums. This is when, the private museums are coming up very strongly. The private collectors are coming up very strongly because they boldly say that, we think that this is a good artist, we think that these are great paintings, and let's deal with that. Whereas museums who have been going around dealing with the intersubjectivities and so on. So we have this situation of having exhibitions that come out very strongly to say, let's celebrate an artist. And SMU is also doing that with an exhibition that is opening on Tuesday, a little bit of commercial, but this is all part of our discussion here. Heman's exhibition will open on Tuesday at the Disuansio Gallery. Now, maybe Maya, you can tell us about how this exhibition has come about. Is your collection, and what do you wish to achieve through this exhibition in SMU?
Thank you very much. So basically, all I would say is that, Professor Kien Chow was very instrumental in having this exhibition, because I told him that let's do an exhibition on Bengal school, and he said, no, focus on a single artist, Heman Mazumdar. So I said, okay, I'll focus on Heman Mazumdar. So I brought all my Heman Mazumdars from Calcutta to here, as well as collected some from other friends of mine to put this exhibition together. And, my thing is, as I said right in the beginning, as an academic, I believe in disagreement and debate, right? That's how we learn. That's how we think harder about our own positions, right? So I want to present this artist to say he's a unique figure in Indian modern art, which is for sure. We can disagree about other things, but he's a unique figure in Indian modern art because he was radical in the way he adopted academic realism and got banished for that. So if you say he's part of Bengal school, well, the Bengal school definitely banished him and told him that you're not allowed even in our rooms, right? So, it couldn't be Bengal school that way, right? And Jamni Roy would say, please don't put me in the Bengal school for sure. And Rabindranath Tagore said, I'm not a cattle, right? Please don't think of me as a cow, okay? So, there is, and I want people to look at and learn. So one of the things we want to do is we want people to always increase their visual vocabulary. So all I'm going to say at this stage is, if you think Heman Mazumdar painted only breasts of women, I invite all of you. You are not allowed any cameras, so no photography. But I'm going to take Zara after this now to the gallery to see before it opens. You're all welcome to come along, but you can't take any photographs. That's the only condition. And see whether they are only painting of women breasts or there's something more than that.
Some bums also. Some bums also. And very beautiful jewelry.
Okay.
No, but it's not just. I'm just being facetious. But they are beautifully painted. But to pick up.
Say, M.F. Hussain, what does he paint? Basically, he paints Picasso's horses.
Yeah, and the Tazia horses, and the okay.
From La Guernica.
Yeah, but to go back a little bit, because I really like this whole idea of the woman in Indian art, and the space of the woman in concepts of the nation. And I think in a Indian context, that is a particularly important one to discuss in terms of who is she? Is she an upper caste woman? Is she not? What does she wear? Because of course it's not politically neutral, right? So, and that part of the reason it's not politically neutral is because very often in a post-colonial context, but particularly in India, the body of the woman becomes a cipher for the body of the nation, right? And within an Indian context, that's a very old concept that you can trace it back to the Puranas, for instance, the 12th century, where you have the Hindu goddess becomes the body Bharat of that nation. And of course, this is also the reason that Hussain gets into trouble in 2005 for a painting that an auction house labels Bharat Mata, Mother India, where he has a naked goddess on the map, right? So to say that the woman isn't represented is not exactly correct, but at the same time, how she's represented has other symbolic significance. And you could almost say then, what happens when a woman's body becomes a cipher for a nation? Not just in India, but elsewhere too. And does that like Virginia Woolf, for instance, once says, if the body of the nation is a woman, then woman has no nation. Because what does it mean to conquer a nation? And what did we see? You know, every time when you have an aspiration to conquer a nation or to take vengeance on an enemy nation, is immediately go and rape the women, right? So is there a connection between desire in a particular kind of way, possession in a different kind of way, and violence? And you know, how does those concepts relate? And they're not innocent.
Great. Okay. Right. We have 5 minutes. Please, open the floor. Please. Yeah. Anyone? Yeah. Yeah.
I was just going to ask if you allow interjections from your side.
Absolutely.
It was a very thought-provoking. Hi, my name is Tara. It was a very thought-provoking panel. I've got so many things going on in my head right now, but there are a few things I would just like to focus on. One, this whole thing of nationalism and Indian identity. I think these are very fraught phrases. And even the idea of the nation, as you said, the nation is a Western concept. Well, the nation state, yes, but I think there has been a concept of India, whatever it was called, Bharat or Hindustan or whatever, whichever way you define it, but that existed for centuries, really did. It was a fluid thing, it was a fluid identity. The other thing I would like to say is that Indian identities traditionally, I think, have been very syncretic and very fluid and very plural. It was the British that came to an extent, this is what we hear and read, that divided Indians so much on the basis of religion or caste that it became more solidified on that basis. And even after partition, I think it's not really accurate to say that the Muslim got excluded in post-independence India, because almost as many Muslims as went to Pakistan actually opted to stay in India. And even till today, the population of Indian Muslims is almost equal to the population of Pakistan. So there are many people that felt that, no, we don't want to go to a country on the basis of religion. And very interesting point that was raised by a lot of you was this business of how Muslims were showing Hindu icons in their art. And this was there even especially in music. Our traditional Indian music, there were the gharanas, so-called. And over generations, there were artists, their sons, their grandsons were part of this gharana. Very often the singers, the instrumentalists were all Muslims, but the Maharajas or the gharana for which they were playing was very often a Hindu one. So I don't think we operated so much on the basis of our religion. There was a very strong sense of Indian identity, and certain things were common to Indians, even Holi, actually, to an extent. Yes, it comes from Hinduism to an extent, but it's actually a pan-Indian festival, and so is Diwali, and so is Christmas for most of us. So I think those are things we should not forget. We did not have such singular religion-based identities that got exacerbated after 47. And at the moment, sadly, in India, it seems to be coming again to the fore, but it's not traditional India. That's my take on it.
And that was very much Zera's point about secularity being, a characteristic of modernity through Bombay, especially.
But also not privileging any religion. That was very important.
And inter-religious or what was multi-religious, religiosity, whatever. Okay, come, we'll take a few more questions together. Yes, please, yeah.
My name is Lim Tiao Bing. I am an outsider of Indian art. However, I have a question on Indian diaspora art based up in touch here. The names that come to mind would be artists like Avinash Chandra and Balraj Khanna, both of whom knew Evan Souza. They migrated to the UK in the 1950s and 60s, respectively. And they were also married to non-Indian women. So would you consider them as Indian artists?
Thank you. We take one or two more, and then we look at them together, given that we have only 3 minutes and 58 seconds. Yeah. Thank you. Anyone else? Last call, because given the time, we will take all the views from the floor, and then we will go back to the panel. Questions and comments from the floor. Any more last call? Thank you very much. Okay, on the question of Indian diasporic art, anyone?
Definitely. I mean, today, Souza is increasingly defined as a British artist. So, yeah, of course you would. And the whole question of diaspora is a whole different one. But yeah.
Let me just add by saying that, when you came on the stage, Tony, you said, I'm the only non-Indian here. Well, I have British citizenship. You have? Singapore. You have?
Singapore
citizen. Who is an Indian? Who knows? Now, except one thing. Do not tell my friend Anish Kapoor he's Indian. He will get so upset. You'll have a row with him immediately.
That's right, he's a British artist.
No, he will not. If you say he's Indian, he will go.
Even Hussein had Qatari as his nationality.
Yeah.
Wasn't it?
But
Yeah.
he didn't, that was not a choice, because he made a big deal about the fact, I am Indian, I'm an artist, that is all, he said. And those were like virtually the last recorded words.
Any other comments on the diaspora? Okay. Any comments, anything, any final comments?
Just a question. When we ask what would a diasporic be Indian, right? I mean, what exactly is going in our mind? Because are there many Indians or many identities? Do everyone think of the same concept, or are we talking about different things? Indian represented at the political level, in art, So we need to probably clarify that before we know and define what, whether diasporic Indian art is Indian. Because
There's a wonderful book by Amartya Sen.
Amartya Sen, about the definitions of multiple identities. Yeah.
Each of us occupy multiple identities.
Anything else
So
before
I
we
guess
close
if
the
you
whole
want to
panel?
be collected by Tate Britain, then you quickly call yourself a British artist, and if you... Yeah, exactly. But you know where they were collected by Tate? It's a big debate now, because only Tate Britain is allowed to buy them. So that's the body that buys them. And now, of course, there's an increasing move, like with Rashid Areen, British artist, but Pakistani British. And he's like, okay, that's fine. Tate Britain can buy me, but I don't want to show there. I want to show in Tate Modern, because I'm an international artist. Don't you dare make me into a British one.
In fact, I'm Indian too. Seriously, because when I was in Kerala, Kochi the other time, and I got into an auto, and I did not understand Malayani, and the driver thought that I was from somewhere in the north, and insisted that I was Indian. So me too. All right. So thank you very much, and thank you for joining the panel today.